So I did say this was a post-production. If you're not an Alpha 1 user, then forgive me for rattling on about the A1. I have created an Alpha 1 only Q&A forum for premium patrons, so the general monthly Q&A forum doesn't get over full with questions all about one camera, because I am aware that more than half of you do not own an Alpha 1 camera, and I am still keen to support and cover all other cameras. So as I said, this is a post-production special. So the first thing I should really cover is now, if you are choosing post-production software, the obvious choices that most people make is Lightroom CC, that's the cloud version, or Lightroom Classic, which is the original version of that Lightroom renamed Classic. When the CC version came out, I would have preferred if they just thought of a completely new name for the cloud version. Of course, there are other options, and that's why I've added or something else. So those or something else could be programs like Capture One, which is the oldest surviving competitor to the Adobe software. A lot of software does appear and then disappear after a few years, so and that makes me slightly nervous about recommending all of the products or all the alternatives. So I'm only recommending 3 at the moment because they have been around for a number of years, and that is Capture One, Luminar and On One software. Now some people don't want to pay a cloud service, a monthly fee for the software, so you can see why some people might go for a one-off purchase. Now I do need to point out there is no such thing as perpetual license software, because as Microsoft or Apple upgrade their operating systems, eventually it will kill the software you're using. So you're either locked into using an old desktop computer or an old laptop, because as soon as you update the operating system, your older software becomes inoperable. So some people, that is to be a plus point for cloud-based software, so that when operating systems update, you will be given the update through your monthly subscription. So there is something to be said for that. So the classic version really is for people who want to work primarily with a desktop or laptop computer, and they manage and look after and archive all of their own images. And as you work for years and years, obviously the storage device you're putting those images on has to be quite a significant investment. Typically what we often refer to as a RAID storage. Now my RAID storage sitting on my desk now is over 20 terabytes, and that is just about to become full. So I need to think about my next step that I'm about to take with that. There is the cloud version, of course, and if you've subscribed to the monthly plan that includes Photoshop and Classic, you can also trial the cloud version. It's part of the photography plan. Now if you bought the photography plan with Photoshop and Lightroom Classic, you're given 100 megabytes, which is sort of a decent amount to play with the software to see whether it's got any merits for you. But if you get committed to the CC, the cloud version, you'll probably want to increase the amount of cloud storage, Adobe Creative Cloud Storage. I've upgraded my storage to the 1 terabyte package. Okay, so or you could just carry on using Capture One, Luminar or On One and look after your own images. I have to say, if you choose the Lightroom Classic or Cloud version, I can support you ongoing. I am a complete novice with Capture One. I'm not that familiar with it, although I do own it, but I was an Adobe ambassador for 14 years and I'm very familiar with the workflows for Classic, Cloud and Photoshop. Okay, so if you are choosing the classic version, then just remember eventually the number of external storage devices is going to become a bit of a nightmare, and those in-out ports, whether it's USB 2, USB 3, USB 3.1, 3.2, whether it's a USB-C port, okay, or Thunderbolt port, those will render old drives inoperable as well, and all drives do fail eventually with amount amount of usage. So this is where people who have decided to look after their own images really, once they start getting nervous about old drives failing, taking away all of their images with them, is a lot of people will eventually end up with a RAID drive. Now basically a RAID drive where we have a particular RAID setup where we can have any one of the drives fail, but the other 4 drives in that 5 drive array have the information that is on that one that has failed. And generally these RAID drives come with accompanying software to monitor the health of all of the drives. So if you get one drive starting to be a little bit suspect of about to fail, the RAID drive will actually send you an email saying, I think you should replace drive number 3 because I don't like the way it's behaving. And you can do what's called hot swap these drives. If you've got a spare empty drive in your drawer, you can just open the drawer, take out the suspect drive, put in the new one. It will take probably more than a day for the other 4 to make friends with the new drive and become a completely operable and secure 5 drive array. Now you can get RAID drives with just 2 drives. But of course it actually makes more sense to increase the number of the drives, so you're not having to put everything on both of the 2 drives in the RAID. They often refer to that as a mirror RAID, so things that are recorded to one drive automatically get backed up on the second drive. We'll talk a little bit more about the cloud now. This is not everybody's cup of tea, but the Creative Cloud I suspect will eventually replace the classic version. Now most people are still using the classic version. Most people still want to look after their own images rather than have Adobe look after your images in their cloud. Now even when you're using their cloud version, you will have a copy of your own images until the hard drive you're using starts to fill up, and then the cloud version of the software will start to remove images to free up space on your working computer, and then just leave the master copies in the cloud. The advantage of running cloud software above and beyond, say, the classic version, of course, is it doesn't really matter where you edit the image. The software will appear on any device you own, and that catalog is replicated across all devices. You don't need to move images from one device to another because they're synchronizing through Adobe's cloud. And so if you add an image to the cloud version on your desktop computer, it automatically, the full resolution version gets uploaded to Adobe's Creative Cloud and then is accessible on your laptop, your tablet, and even your smartphone. Now it is possible to synchronize classic version with the cloud, but the full resolution RAW files do not get uploaded to Adobe's Creative Cloud, just mini versions of your RAW files. And it is a little bit buggy, I have to say, so I've stopped syncing classic with the cloud. If I want files to, the full resolution RAW files to be stored by the Adobe Creative Cloud, I add them to the CC catalog. I don't let Lightroom Classic try to sync them. This post that I created on my blog on my website got me into a little bit of trouble. Some people got very angry with me. And it was a response to some people, paid advocates for Capture One, which were basically started posting images like 10 reasons why I would never use Lightroom or Photoshop. So I put up an equivalent counter argument, which was 10 reasons why I won't be switching to Capture One. Now I've got nothing against Capture One per se, but I thought some of the articles that were appearing were a bit one-sided, so I just wanted to state my side, and this led a lot of people being very angry with me, writing to me in capitals, which is always a sure sign that I've upset somebody. And it was just an opinion piece. So some of those reasons, and that blog post is still up on my website if you want to check it out. It's top 10 reasons why I won't be switching to Capture One Pro. Now, one of those reasons is, and one of the main reasons is, I incorporate Photoshop in some of my editing workflows. Only probably 1 in 100 images ever sees Photoshop, but I do need Photoshop as a working photographer. And so because I need Photoshop, that means I've already got Lightroom. And if I've already got Lightroom, buying Capture One is an additional purchase on the top of Lightroom. And I actually think Lightroom is as good as Capture One. Some Capture One advocates and ambassadors will disagree there, but there's been some very experienced post-production editors that run side-by-side tests. Any post-production software can't make an image sharper than your camera lens combination. It can't make your images have less noise. There are noise reduction algorithms that these software run, but of course all of those change over time with each new version of Lightroom and Capture One. The interfaces are very different, and the starting points for editing these files are quite different, but the outcomes that can be achieved by both Lightroom and Capture One, there's perhaps no difference. You can get the same quality output regardless of what software you're using. I also personally like the integration between Lightroom and Photoshop. I can open up a raw file embedded in a layer from Lightroom. I can open up that raw file into Photoshop as what's called a smart object layer, and so that is in fact it's the only completely non-destructive workflow where I never need to rasterize or convert that file into a pixel-based image. Okay, obviously I do like that synchronizing feature of the cloud service, so that is a plus point for me for having access to the cloud version of Lightroom as well as the classic version. I have absolute confidence in Adobe's ongoing support. It is the oldest of any of the software. It actually precedes the first digital SLR by 1 year. It was launched in 1990 and Kodak first came out with its first DSLR in 1991. And I've been using Photoshop pretty much from the beginning, and I know it's in there for the long haul. It's a very, very large company with very good business practice, so its share price is always rising, never on the decline. Even big companies like Apple got out of its competing software, a piece of software called Aperture, and people who had spent thousands of hours building catalogs of all of their raw images were dismayed to find out that Apple no longer wanted to support that going forward when they created a new operating system. That let a lot of Apple users down. Of course, the most popular plugins and presets and companion software you can get are for Photoshop and Lightroom. It's a bit of a hit and miss affair if you're running one of the smaller or one of the softwares run by the smaller companies. And I did cover that last point there called image quality. So there is a diagram of me opening a raw image into a smart object layer, and obviously that is required if I'm doing things like compositing. This next slide also showcases something that I can do in Photoshop that I can't do in Lightroom. This image was captured at 1/2000th of a second, and the background is pin sharp. It almost looks like this longboarding guy who's traveling at probably 70 kilometers an hour. The actual raw image looked like he was static. You know, it's almost like he was about to fall off a static longboard, but of course he was zooming along, coming around a corner. So I wanted to create that slow pan effect in post-production, and I did that using a path blur. So I was able to apply the lens blur filter to a path following the curvature of the road. And this is something that Lightroom just simply can't go anywhere near. So that edit required the heavy hitting software of Photoshop for that post-production. Here is just a studio portrait now edited with a lot of effects such as a particle layer of snow and also lens flare, and again this was quite a sophisticated edit in Photoshop, and none of these effects could have been applied in Lightroom or Capture One. And one of the great things about compositing, if that is part of the workflow that you do, is we can also use the libraries, the stock library. I think Adobe purchased their own stock library, so that you could simply drag a stock image onto your image that you're compositing. So I got this image of a guy smoking a pipe, except there was no smoke coming out of the pipe. So I just searched for smoke in the library and then drag that stock image on, so I could complete the composite. And then if that was successful and the client agrees, I just pay for that stock image, I think $10–12, and the composite was complete, royalty-free stock. Now, if you are into some of those elements like the flare and the textures that I was just showcasing on some of those images, I do on my website have downloadable files. If you just go to the Photoshop Actions, I do have files you can download if you want to add flare in post-production. It's actually much easier to add it than try and recreate it in camera. A lot of the very fine G and G Master lenses now are very slow to actually flare at all, so it's hard to create that very aggressive flare look without maybe going out and buying a really bad lens. Okay, and of course there's those special effect layers, just like this lens blur filter technique, which makes the New York look like Toy Town here, where we create a very aggressive blur in the foreground and receding background, which defies the laws of depth of field, but creates a very interesting post-production effect there that I've got, and this was popular a few years back. And of course, the best quality post-production for skin is typically done in Photoshop. It's very hard to get anywhere close to this in post-production software such as Capture One or Lightroom. And this technique, very high-end technique, is called frequency separation, and uses basically we divide the file into high frequency and low frequency layers, so the overall shape of the image is on one layer and the fine detail is on a second. So this allows us to modify and perfect the medium frequency layer and the high frequency layers without impacting on those low frequency layers. One of the things that people often say about post-production is I prefer to do it in camera, and I have to say that serious post-production editing didn't arrive with the first version of Photoshop. It predated that, because even before Photoshop I was doing serious amounts of post-production editing in a darkroom, and Ansel Adams was also doing this. He was basically just collecting information on his black and white film, and he would really create the drama of the scene in the darkroom, not in camera. And so if you look at an image like this moonrise image, he would print this throughout his life, and each version that he came out of the darkroom was slightly different than the version before. He always said like the film was his music score. He was making a musical comparison here, but the performance was in the darkroom. And we could say very much about Lightroom now is the raw files really are just the music score for somebody who is then going to create the masterpiece in post-production. If you are going to get serious about your post-production and you start getting fussy about color fidelity, color accuracy, the whole argument about color science is really a moot point if you've never actually ever calibrated and profiled your monitor. And so you really don't want to get caught up in those discussions if you've not done what you can see in this slide here, which is to dangle a monitor calibration device, which then creates a profile, a color profile for your specific monitor. There are great variations between monitors, even of the same brand and model number, so you really have to get the characteristics nailed and documented for your particular specific model before you can even move forward with tweaking or massaging color. So one of the other things you might want to invest in, apart from just the calibration device, is just look at how accurate your monitor actually is. There are a few good examples of monitors on high-end laptops, but most of them are average or below average in quality. If you are running a laptop, you can, however, plug your laptop into a much better quality and larger and higher resolution desktop monitor. And the ones that I've been using over the last few years are made by BenQ. They're not the only manufacturer, but what you're looking for is 10 12-bit monitors with large color gamuts, and often they're advertised as color accurate monitors, as are these BenQ monitors. This is my current monitor that I'm working on now, which is a 32-inch monitor. They also have a much better value for money 27-inch 4K monitor. Now, there are two main companies that deal with the color management side of this. It's color science is really a phrase that Canon coined. Much better description of what we're doing here is color management. Now, there are two companies that are working on the equipment required. One is called X-Rite, and the other one is called Data Color. Now, Data Color refer to their products as spiders. This is a spider checker for creating a preset for your camera. This measures the inaccuracies of your color in recording a raw file, and then if you apply the preset, it will put those colors back where they need to be truly accurate. I think I actually prefer the X-Rite version. They have what's called a color passport, and that creates an actual physical profile you can load if you're using Lightroom. But you can't use these products if you're using Capture One. You know, that's a bit of a shame. There may come a version of Capture One, or there might be a plug-in that you can use to get these products working. But when I last asked Data Color, they said they don't recommend these products for working with Capture One. It is specifically a Lightroom Photoshop tool here. If you do this, however, whether you're using the Spider Checker or the X-Rite Color Passport, it is quite possible to get cameras from different manufacturers all producing colors that look on your color managed screen looking pretty much identical. So again, that whole topic of does a Canon or does a Nikon or does a Sony have better colors than the Fuji is a non-argument, because if you profile your camera as well as your monitor, you are in complete control over producing accurate color. Okay, let's moving on now. Let's run some images through a workflow. Now, typically I don't start with all sliders, whether I'm using the cloud version or the classic version. They're basically using the same Adobe Camera Raw engine. Even if you take an image through Bridge or into Photoshop, it's the same Adobe Camera Raw engine driving all of those products. The interfaces might differ slightly, but if I'm showing you now the cloud version, whatever you can do in the cloud version, you can do in the classic version. So one of the things that you can do is you can create a preset in Lightroom or in the classic version or the CC version or even Adobe Camera Raw that flows through and allows you to create a new starting point for your image editing. My new starting point is typically not to have all of the sliders in the basic panel or the edit panel, the light panel, all zeroed. I typically start with my highlights down, my shadows up, add a little bit of contrast, and I may even raise the exposure slightly. I might fine tune all of the sliders from there, but my starting point opens up the shadows and brings the highlights down, and just to make sure that the images still have a little bit of punch, add a little bit of contrast. So that is my starting preset, and it doesn't matter whether I'm using the classic or CC versions. I typically don't start with everything zeroed out. The other thing that you can also do with the profiles is if you have actually profiled your camera, we're using the X-Rite Color Passport, you can pick up that custom profile from the profiles panel. Now if you haven't profiled your camera, you might instead just look at the variations of starting points. This is why some people said that Capture One might be better than Lightroom, because it has a different starting point, and that's all to do with just choosing a different starting profile. So Adobe Standard was replaced by Adobe Color, which lean more towards the Capture One starting point. But of course you can also pick up the camera profiles or camera matching profiles that will be included when you're shooting in the raw file format. So here, you can maybe look at the camera standard, the camera vivid, camera neutral, just to see whether those outperform your Adobe Color. Again, they really only make sense to do this if you've calibrated and profiled your monitor. Now if I just zero everything out and look at the unedited raw file, which looks quite dark, typically I will underexpose images slightly if I'm working in bright sunshine conditions and I need to protect really bright highlights. Now I can't really look at which profile to apply until I've applied my preset. Okay, so it's important that before I even go anywhere near choosing a profile, I might have wanted to do some work on the file, such as open up and brighten the image before I can sensibly choose which profile looks best. If I've already applied my camera start preset, I will then fine tune maybe the exposure slider. The contrast, highlights, shadows are pretty close to the starting point, and then I'll fine tune the whites and blacks. Now on many of the software, if you hold down the Alt Option key and slide either the whites or blacks, you can find out where highlight clipping starts and where black are crushed to absolute black. And if you're familiar with Ansel Adams zone systems, the only thing that should clip to absolute white is the light source or the reflection of the light source in a shiny surface, such as the sunlight reflecting off water or sunlight reflecting off chrome metal. The only thing that should blacks that should crush to absolute black is the absence of a surface. Maybe the cave entrance should clip to absolute black. Now this is a personal preference, but I often find myself adding a little bit of darkening to the corners. Now I have to remember not to do this when I'm reviewing a lens, because the corners of an image getting darker is actually the weakness of a particular lens when shooting wide open. But because I like to shoot wide open and I like the corners of my image to be slightly darker, it's one of the things that I will do for aesthetic reasons. I like the way it draws the eye into the subject if the corners are just a little bit darker than the center of the image. The other thing that I will typically do, there's quite a conservative amount of sharpening on raw files. It used to be, the default used to be 25, and then it was raised to 40, again chasing Capture One, which tends to over sharpen the images by default. And one of the things that I'm always a little bit sad that Lightroom and Adobe Camera doesn't do is apply a masking to the sharpening. Typically what you're trying to do in post-production sharpening is just increase the contrast right at the edge, and you typically don't want to sharpen the smooth areas of bokeh, because all you're going to do is make the image artifacts and noise more apparent. So typically I would always encourage you to raise that masking slider. If you hold your finger down on the Alt Option key on the keyboard as you raise that masking slider, you'll go into what's called threshold view. Any areas that become black will not be exposed to the sharpening process, and so typically you would try and pick a masking value where you weren't sharpening any of the background of the sky in this instance. Okay, any other things that I might do is this won't render my image completely color accurate, but what I often do, because of the high contrast nature of working in midday sun, is I might bring the tone of the blue sky down a touch. So I'll go into the luminance values in the HSL panel and bring the blues down by 10 or 20, just so the brightest highlights are on the subject, not behind the subject in the sky. And let's go and look at profiles again. If you are choosing a different profile and you want to be able to access that profile very quickly, you can click in the top right hand corner of the profile and add that to your favorites panel. So you can then access that favorite profile without actually coming into the profiles panel at all. You can access it from the drop down menu. The default will typically be Adobe Color or one of the camera standard profiles, but you can just switch over to an alternative profile now from your drop down menu. So as I can see again, this is the unedited file. You might think I'm having a really bad day with exposure here, but what I'm actually doing is purposely underexposing by 1 stop, because I'm trying to protect the white clouds behind the subject. Now the subject is more than 2 stops underexposed in this instance, or approximately 2 stops, but I know the quality of the full frame sensors on the Sony cameras will allow me to recover or restore the shadows in post-production. When I was shooting this image, the foreground wouldn't actually look this dark, because if you've got the dynamic range optimizer switched on, the dynamic range optimizer will serve to lighten the very dark shadows for JPEGs and movies, but won't be applied to the raw images. So when you get these raw images into Lightroom, you will natively see the shadows look much darker than you remember seeing them on the camera, unless you switch the dynamic range optimizer off. I don't actually recommend switching the dynamic range optimizer off, because it will lead some people to raising the exposure and then clipping the highlights perhaps in the sky accidentally, and those will be irrecoverable if you've done that in camera. So you can see those shadows restore quite well. Here I've raised the shadow slider to +80 because they were really quite dark in the capture, and raise the exposure. I will carry on raising the contrast as well. If you are lowering the highlights significantly and raising the shadows significantly, typically you get this artificially flat look if you tried to restore the dynamic range. So often you do need to add contrast to get that the gamma sort of looking quite punchy and looking normal again by adding that contrast. Some people will try doing this adding clarity, but I prefer typically to be doing it using contrast. You might want to fine-tune the white balance at this point, just to get the skin tones looking natural. And again, here in this particular image, I've darkened the blue skies. You might want to write that blue darkening, if you're doing it a lot, into your preset file, your starting preset file. I would encourage you not to get too aggressive with lowering the luminance of the blues. It will bring in artifacts if you start moving that slider below -30. So be a little bit careful. The blue channel of a raw file will be a little bit noisier than the other color information, so just be a little bit careful when the raw file gets converted to an RGB file that your blues aren't excessively noisy. Okay, next I'll come in with some dodging and burning. A quick way of doing this is just to draw radial gradients, adding half a stop here, taking half a stop away there. Now you can work and invert the radial gradient, so you're working outside of the central area rather than inside. So just make sure you've got you make sure you know where your effect is being applied. It should be really obvious with an exposure adjustment that we're going inside the radial filter, not outside. But you do have that invert checkbox you can check if you're working on the wrong side. I could do this manually with an adjustment brush, or again I can just drag a very large radial filter and just lower the background illuminance there by half a stop, so again the skies don't become the brightest thing in the frame. I would always encourage you to work with the maximum feather, or at least a healthy amount of feather when you're working with these radial filters, otherwise people will see where you've been darkening and lightening. Now you may think that this is all new stuff to Photoshop and Lightroom, but of course I was doing this in dark rooms before I'd even heard the word Photoshop, and so typically people used to dodge and burn in dark rooms to do exactly what we're doing here. I'm also a fan of linear gradients or graduated filters, just darkening the top of the image slightly. Now you'll notice as I reduce the exposure of the highlights and using the exposure and highlight sliders, I'll typically raise the shadow slider so that because I don't want to darken his dark hoodie as well, it's already dark enough. Just so by raising that shadow slider, make sure that I'm predominantly bringing down the midtones and highlights and leaving the shadows where they are. I'll also typically add a linear filter or graduated filter from the bottom of the image going up towards the center of the image. Now this might be to darken, but in this instance, because the foreground was so dark, I'm actually brightening the foreground, and I'm also lowering the saturation. In this instance I noticed the saturation of his legs was getting a little bit vivid there, or vibrant, and that can often happen if you're expanding out the tonal range. Colors can sort of grow in saturation as a byproduct of you increasing contrast. So and again finishing off with a little bit of a vignette if it wasn't already applied by the preset. And so there is my finished version, which has come quite a long way from that original image, but I have to say that probably in its entirety or only took me less than 2 minutes to go from the starting position to the finished position. I have to say that contrast is the biggest enemy when we're shooting in the raw file format. Images will always look contrasty than we remember them, and so when I'm shooting this wedge-tailed eagle with the 135 and bird eye AF activated, it's doing a great job, but the shadows are very dark, and you can see I couldn't have raised the exposure anymore in camera, otherwise the highlights on the bird's feet there would have clipped to absolute white, and I would have lost what will become a hero image that I always remember associated to the Alpha 1 review that I captured on the second day of shooting. So contrast is the enemy, and typically we just come in. Those starting settings will, as you can see why it's become a default for me, is I often find myself shooting in high contrast situations, so I don't want to be doing the same sort of 3 slider adjustment every time I'm adjusting, or 4 slider adjustment. So contrast, highlights, shadows, exposure all get adjusted pretty much from the get-go in order to modify this image so it gets anywhere close to what I remember looking at the subject when photographing it through the viewfinder. Again, contrast is typically our enemy when we're working with these bright skies and people in shadow. Typically I will put the light behind the subject to get more drama and to get better, softer lighting over the subjects I'm photographing, but this does create these very bright backgrounds. And so again we dive in with a little bit of dodging and burning. I'll bring down the highlights using the highlight slider. I'll bring up the subject using a big radial filter with +1/2 or +1 stop. So the eyes are now, the whites of the eyes are now the brightest thing in the shot, not the white sky behind this beautiful portrait of this triathlon guy here. Another issue that cameras often make mistakes with, not only contrast, is also white balance. I'd say 99% photographers these days have auto white balance, but as soon as we point the camera with a dominant color in that viewfinder, cameras think, oh, there's too much blue, let's throw in some warm tones to try and correct how much blue there is that I'm looking at. And of course, pointing the camera at blue water, that's a lot of blue, so the initial view of this scene will look orange because the camera is overcorrecting incorrectly. And so I do have to grab that white balance slider and slide the color temperature way over to the blues in order to say, no, there should be a lot of blue in this file because it's blue water, and we get a much more natural color rendition. And so yes, you could perhaps decide not to use auto white balance. You could, let's say, just set the white balance to daylight, but often even then that will need some adjustments, because if you're working at the last light of day or the first light of day, a daylight color temperature isn't going to be particularly accurate even then, so you're still going to find yourself doing a manual adjustment. Now, I've had quite a few questions just recently. It's a topic I do revisit from time to time, because as people start shooting with fast shutter speeds or in low ambient light, that old enemy noise starts rearing its head, and people start looking at my images that I've shot at 5,000, 6,400, 12,800, and they always start saying, Mark, your images at high ISO look much better than my images at high ISO. What exactly are you doing here? I've included this slide now in all of my ebooks to let people know exactly what I'm doing, and that is, the important things to do is keep sharpening conservative. Don't start ramping up your sharpening to 80, 90, 100, so leave it at 40 or 60. Raise that masking slider so we're not sharpening the noise as well as our subject. Avoid using clarity, which will also accentuate noise as well. Add a small amount of noise reduction, 15 or 20. We can raise the detail just to restore a little bit of the fine detail of the subject if we've been raising the noise reduction to 20 or 25. Color noise reduction is pretty much good at 25. Occasionally you might find myself raising that to 50, but 25 usually does the trick quite nicely. And then and only then is the one that really comes into play, is apply heavy amounts of noise reduction to the areas of the image that doesn't have fine detail. The defocused bokeh areas, the background areas of your image, you can go to town on these and raise the noise reduction to plus 80, plus 100. And you might even combine that with reducing the texture slider just to smooth out the bokeh to create a more silky smooth bokeh in the background. Now I might start off with a radial filter and then just pick up the little mini brush behind the big adjustment brush, just the word brush, not the actual icon of the brush, and then you can fine tune. You can start adding and adding that noise reduction closer and closer into your subject. It's always worth having the auto masking feature on now, so that as we approach the subject we don't accidentally steal fine detail from our subject by accidentally painting onto a bit of the subject as well. I have to say that noise reduction workflow only takes me 3 or 4 minutes, but I can understand why some people think it's too much work. And so a couple of friends started saying to me, have you tried the DeNoise software, Topaz DeNoise AI? Everything's got in this artificial intelligence now. And so with a curious streak, I thought, okay, I'll just pay the $79 or whatever, download the software and see how well or good a job it actually does. Maybe I've been painting noise reduction myself for too long. Maybe I should let another program do it automatically. So I decided I would throw a couple of my hero high ISO images at Topaz DeNoise AI, and just to see how it does. So I got this Alpha 7 R3. I couldn't do anything other in camera. I'm shooting with the aperture wide open. It's the first light of day with these children riding to school. There is some sunlight appearing in the background, but it's not on these children in the foreground. So combined with a fast shutter speed, maximum aperture, the ISO has climbed to 12,800 ISO. Some people artificially lower the high ISO parameter for auto ISO, which I don't advocate you do that, because all that would have happened in this instance, I would have shot at my artificially low ceiling of 3,200 or 6,400, and the subjects would have blurred because of motion blur, and I would have lost the shot. So I just have to put up with DeNoise, or do I? Okay, so I did work this in Lightroom, but now I'm going to work this in Topaz DeNoise. So I noticed with the auto setting, it didn't do a great job. There was still noise left in some of the structure of the bokeh and at some of the edges of the subject. Obviously it had trouble working out what the appropriate edges were in the subject, and it erred on the side of caution and left some heavy noise in some of the structure of the bokeh, maybe where in the center of the image there, where you can see a little bit of sunlight in the leaves on the trees, and also on the edges of the girl on the right with her arm leading up to her ear there. So I've had to switch off the auto setting and then keep on raising the remove noise slider until it got rid of all of the noise in the bokeh and around some of the problematic edges. But what I noticed then is it has started attacking some of the native natural texture in our subjects. So I noticed this most clearly in the subject on the right. She's got a weave of her jumper, her woolen jumper there, where the weave is going, oh, the AI now thinks that's noise, so I have to remove that as well. And so you can see this silky smooth artificial smoothness appearing on the jersey or jumper of this young woman on the right. Fortunately for Topaz DeNoise is we can recover or restore or subtract some of that noise reduction. And so I went in with the masking facility. I selected the subtract. I subtract some of the excessive noise reduction, and I just painted on over the area of which had been artificially smooth. So just a couple of brush strokes there with that masking. I applied that and it restored rich detail in that area. And so I have to say, looking at this processed image, ISO 12,800 points out of 10, I'm going to give it a 9. I think this has done an amazing job, actually better than I expected. Now you still had to do a little bit of manual work to get there, you still had to do a little bit of brush work, but I have to say a lot less brush work. Now I actually applied Topaz DeNoise AI not onto the 50 megapixel image. I did notice that it was a little bit slow. Unless you've got a really top of the range computer with hexacore processors, you're going to find that Topaz DeNoise AI is going to struggle with 50 and 60 megapixel files. So I actually trialed this out by exporting a 4K file from Lightroom and running Topaz DeNoise AI on the 4K file. And then it could work quite quickly, and I suspect that it might work quite quickly on 24 megapixel files as well. So another feature has come to my attention that I also wanted to trial to give you feedback on, which was enhance super resolution in post-production using Adobe's software. Now there is an enhance feature in Lightroom, but it's not currently available in Lightroom. You have to access it through the Adobe Camera Raw. So if you try opening one of your RAW files in Photoshop or from Bridge, you might find that now you can access that feature. I suspect it may appear in Lightroom on a future Lightroom release, but at the moment, if you want to access this feature, you're going to have to use Adobe Camera Raw. And that perhaps is another reason why the Adobe suite of packages as part of your plan does make a lot of sense, is we're accessing more software than just a raw converter. Now I wanted to show this enhanced super resolution feature on an image that I shot just a week or two ago. I was giving a one-on-one workshop on the beach, and this dog came running, and I just pointed my 135 G Master up towards this dog, rolled off a few exposures. I wasn't nearly close enough, and I was only using a 24 megapixel alpha 9.2. So you can see the crop, the hero crop on this has come below. Usually I won't crop below 3840 pixels on the longest dimension, which is a 4K file for a 4K monitor. But in order to get a hero crop here, I've cropped down to 2580 pixels. So this may look good on a 15-inch laptop supporting a 2.5K screen, but it starts going to look a little bit soft if viewed on a large 27-inch, 30-inch, 32-inch 4K, or even on a very large 4K TV. We're going to start to erode fine detail. So what I've done is I've taken that raw file and opened it up in Adobe Camera Raw. I've clicked on the super resolution checkbox, and this doubles the pixel dimensions in width and height. So we're going to increase the number of pixels 4 times. Now sometimes it gets very pessimistic and might say it's going to take minutes, but typically even with these 24 megapixel files it only took a few seconds and created a copy of your raw file. So you'll see there that I've created a super resolution file, and now when I open that raw file in Lightroom, it's recorded as being 5161 even after the crop. And as I lean into my 32-inch monitor to see how good a job it's done, I'm going, yeah, I'm going to give you 9 out of 10 as well, because that is a very good, what the word is called, interpolation. We grow the file size by adding pixels intelligently, and it's done a really good job, I think. So what I wanted to do was to do a side-by-side comparison. Now if you're viewing this on your mobile phone or just on your iPad, you're not going to probably see the difference here. If you're viewing this 4K video presentation on a large 4K monitor, your 27-inch desktop monitor, you are possibly going to pick the one on the right as going, yeah, Mike, I can quite clearly see that is a much better, sharper file on the right. So that was definitely advantageous running that through Adobe Camera Raw Super Resolution. And this is where I'm going to put my neck out now and say I could have, if I'd been using a 100-400 or a 70-200, if I'd put on the 1.4 teleconverter, is this better than using a teleconverter? And I would possibly say it's as good as using a 1.4 teleconverter to get closer to your subject. But I think it's got even the advantage is I'm not going to compromise the tracking performance by using a teleconverter on a lens. So there are some merits to running a post-production workflow here in this instance, rather than attaching maybe a 1.4 or 2 times teleconverter. And if you're looking at this hero file now on your 4K, knowing that it was cropped down to 2001, I can't remember what it was, 2580 pixels, and now we're seeing it as a 4K file, you can see that it actually looks pretty damn good. So again, I found myself in an instance where I was doing that bird sequence, the bird sequence which this bird went behind the obstacle, and I showed you the tracking performance. I'm also a little bit too far away from the bird, and if I'm cropping in to get that hero file of the bird in flight, again on my 24 megapixel sensor, you'll see that I'm over cropping to get that 4K file. I've come down to 2600 pixels now to get that bird in flight. So what I've decided to do is just to with the super resolution file, before I export the 4K file to run through Topaz DeNoise, because this was captured at 2,500 ISO, and as you crop more aggressively, you're basically zooming in on that noise. So we are reaching sort of the limits of a heavily cropped image on the 24 megapixel A9. So not only am I running it through super resolution, I'm now going to run it through a Topaz DeNoise to get rid of some of that background noise. Now what I noticed is if you have run a file through super resolution, you do want to export this file with very minimal amounts of sharpening. Otherwise this is going to pose another problem for Topaz DeNoise. So normally when I'm exporting this 4K file from Lightroom, I would add more sharpening than I'm adding here now, so it looks on the tad soft side. But when I get it into Topaz DeNoise, there is an enhanced sharpness feature, and even without using that feature, it's still looking pretty good now. Topaz DeNoise is doing a really good job of that noise in the background. So look, it's not just around there, the eye and the beak, that it's getting a little bit crunchy for me, but we are getting really quite a good file. You might even think it's worthy of a folio file of a bird in flight. So not as good as a native 4K file, but getting close, I think, and maybe better than using those teleconverters again. And so that I'm going full screen on this now to show you this bird in flight, and we got a surprising amount of detail in the feather structure here to warrant the double processing through super resolution and Topaz DeNoise. And there's that side-by-side comparison again, just so you can say, yep, I think it was worth running that post-process workflow. Now if you are using Lightroom, I am getting quite a few people saying, can you give us a little bit more help in post-production, which is why I was wanting to create this post-production seminar special. So first thing, before you ask specific questions, you really have to watch my Lightroom Classic or Lightroom CC Masterclass video. They usually run for 2 hours, so only ask the specific questions if you've watched this video tutorial a couple of times. If you're looking at running the Classic and you're getting a little bit confused about the asset management, where you're storing images, are you archiving your images properly, can Lightroom find those archived images, there is an ebook and a supporting movie called Catalog Management. So premium Patreon members will be able to download that catalog management ebook and then start running through that. I do offer a workflow that should help you out if you have been encountering lost files in a Lightroom Classic catalog, something that you'll probably never ever experience if you're running the cloud version. I also have an ebook and a movie just to support the book building module of Lightroom, and I do encourage everybody not just to look at their images online, but to create physical hard copies. If you're not framing your images and putting them on your wall, certainly move through to a folio book of the best images of the last 5 years or the last 2 years, or your big adventure to Africa, pre-COVID of course. Just try and get a book created for that big adventure that you've done. It is a very good process of sequencing images and working out companion images on a double page spread. I also have a movie specifically designed, and ebook again for color management. And so if you're new to this subject, then this might take a couple of watches to get comfortable with. Some people may not be able to watch the whole movie or read the whole book ebook in one sitting. It does get a little bit difficult, but once you've set up a color managed workflow, it stays set up. It's not something you're going to have to remember. You basically set it up and then it's pretty much a no-brainer from there on. A lot of people know me for my alpha videos, you know I've got 100 hours or more of alpha videos, but what some people forget is I've got a lot of Lightroom video tutorials. I looked at this playlist here and I've got 82 Lightroom video tutorials. So if some people are saying, would you recommend a formal course in Lightroom? And I would say, well, you could, but I can also offer you that support through Patreon. So first of all, have you watched the 82 video tutorials I've created? Some might be raising their eyebrows now, going, do I really want to watch that many video tutorials? I have to say half of them are only 1 minute long. Adobe, while I was an Adobe ambassador, set me on this task of making 1 minute video tutorials about a single feature or a single button in Lightroom. So some of them won't take that long to watch. Another person that you certainly should check out if you're interested in getting up to speed with Photoshop or Lightroom is the Adobe evangelist called Julianne Cost. She's the only full-time paid educator who works creating tutorials to educate people about new features and good workflows using Lightroom and Photoshop. She is definitely the person to go to first because she doesn't want to be paid for her tutorials because she gets paid by Adobe, and she also shares the same floor in the same building as the engineers writing that software. So if she's confused about a new feature, she only needs to invite somebody for a coffee in the canteen or just walk down the corridor and knock on somebody's door and say, can I just talk to you for 5 minutes about this feature because I want to make a video tutorial. I just want to make sure I understand the new feature absolutely before I commit to making a video tutorial. So I dare say she's got hundreds and hundreds of video tutorials, and you should be able to search for them because I do notice there's a little search icon in the top right hand corner of her blog. So there, check her out and see if you can get up to speed. Now, some people are wanting to skill up with Photoshop and you want to check out some of my video tutorials as well as Julianne Cost. I do have some video tutorials for Photoshop. Now, I have hidden them from view on my website because I did actually sell a whole course to a private photography college, and one of the conditions of selling that course was I put some of my Photoshop tutorials into hiding. So there's a link down there at the bottom of your screen. So after you've finished with markdaylog.com, put the /product-category/tutorials, and some of those tutorials should become visible to you. Those first three that you can see there are 3 video tutorials I actually wrote for a university running a Photoshop course. They were designed for the students to tackle them one at a time with an assignment, and there were 3 of these courses or 3 of these projects for a 12-week course in Photoshop. So I thought very carefully about getting the maximum amount of learning in the minimum number of tutorials or projects. So I definitely check out those 3 if you're wanting to build up an understanding of Photoshop. And then I'll point you to some more external Photoshop resources after you've consumed these 3 projects. Okay, if you're watching this because you're a YouTube member, and I've probably heard me mention Patreon numerous times now, if you haven't already done so, you probably want to cancel your membership on YouTube and take out a Patreon membership instead. I get notifications from Patreon, and I've had to turn off my notifications on YouTube because when you get over 100,000 followers, your phone turns into a vibrator mode if you've got notifications left on for YouTube. So come over to Patreon. I can organize the learning resources much more on Patreon than I can on the YouTube membership there. So and I would encourage you to take out the Patreon membership, the $10 per month, if you want to access the ebooks, camera setting files. I'm going to start distributing raw files for new cameras and lenses I check as well. So that was a pretty long one, but that concludes the seminar 24. Just remember, there's an archive of 23 more seminars waiting for you to watch if you get bored or you get locked down in a pandemic COVID lockdown. So there's plenty of learning resources to access, whether you're premium or just standard membership there. So okay, I'll look forward to catching up and supporting you on the Q&A forums in the months to come.